Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper and our series Being Reflective. This is part of the podcast where Bobby and I revisit past episodes to reflect on what strikes us now listening back, what we've learnt and are still learning, and threads we might have missed or forgotten to unravel. Today, I was going to be talking about an episode that was part of our month-long series on love in February 2024. I've been thinking about love a lot because I've just taken on a new role and I've had to move away from home. And I started doing more practical leadership. Love and leadership is something that really interests me. It's something that I think is so important. I wish we wouldn't be afraid of talking about love in leadership. That I wish we'd get more comfortable about talking about love in leadership. So that was what you were going to get. But then, as always, my brain disappeared down a rabbit hole. One of the things that I have had to really, really think about in the role that I'm in now is, and it's still about love, but it's much more about self-compassion. Working in a humanitarian space, and so many people I know working in humanitarian spaces really struggle with this idea of self-compassion. And so today I'm going to be talking about an episode that was published in June 2024 called Being a Stand for Self-Compassion. Now, one of the things that many people say that they love about the podcast is the element of vulnerability, or that Bobby and I are not afraid to be vulnerable in what we say on the podcast. And I guess that's because we don't equate vulnerability with weakness, which I know is something that many people, and particularly many leaders, really struggle with. For those people who do, I strongly suggest you have a listen to Brené Brown's now iconic TEDx talk on vulnerability, because it really has been life-changing for so many leaders. So this is an episode where we are particularly vulnerable, and Bobby talks very candidly about how she struggled in the work that she did in order to become a somatic coach, in terms of that piece of being compassionate with herself, and how painful and difficult that was. I think I'm maybe not as far along on that journey, still really struggle with some of the guilt that is associated with this idea that we have to put our masks on first, that we have to look after ourselves. So a few things that came out from the episode that really struck me that are necessary for people to be able to be more self-compassionate, to actually start to take care of themselves and realize that it's an important part of being a leader. Because let's not forget that when things get hard, when there's a need to be flexible or reactive, or there's an emergency or a crisis, if you don't have something in the tank as a leader, then you're going to fail. You are not going to be able to be the leader that you need to be and that others need you to be in that situation. So you need something in the tank. This is all about resilience, and we talk about that a lot throughout various episodes. But in order to have resilience, we have to be taking care of ourselves and being able to recognize when we need to take care of ourselves. And so that really is the first step that I've taken away from the episode. And that is that we need to be self-reflective, we need to be self-aware, and we need to be able to spot when our tanks are getting low, or when we haven't got the energy and the resilience to be able to be there for other people when they need it. Being self-reflective is super important. And it is a good habit to get into, and feeds into this pathway that's required. So, whether that is in the form of writing or journaling, or having some form of self-reflective piece at the end of the day, at the end of the week, that is really stage one of what needs to happen. And then step number 2 is realizing that you have to be proactive. This isn't something that just happens, and it's not just this sort of fluffy thing that's nice to do. And I know Bobby hates the concept of fluffy, or apart from in the case of bunnies and puppies. But it's not a fluffy thing. If you're going to be a leader, in my opinion, you have to make sure that you are the leader that people need you to be. And therefore, the elements of self-compassion and self-care are all actually things you need to do as part of your job, as part of your role as a leader. So maybe sometimes that takes away a little bit of the guilt associated with it seeming to be selfish, because it's not. Let's get this straight. It's not selfish. You're doing it so that you are there for other people, as well as, of course, making sure that you don't go batshit crazy and end up in a corner with pants on your heads and pencils up your nose. It's an active thing that you need to schedule. So when I say schedule, I mean you schedule the reflective pieces if it's not something that you're used to. You schedule the self-care that comes out of your self-reflective piece. You schedule the breaks. You make sure that you model leaving loudly. You make sure that you have your happy list, or you create the environment outside of work, particularly if you're away from home, that gives you those little glimmers that are necessary to lift your mood. And you actively reflect on what boundaries you need to establish, what you need to be able to keep being and doing what you need to do. And that may result in you establishing boundaries about times, working hours, about availability, about a need to take breaks. I often just need to go for a walk and to move. If I find that I've been stuck at a desk or in meetings all day, I will get up and walk around. I know that it really freaks people out. I have to explain to people now that because I'm old, I get stiff and I need to walk. And everyone kind of accepts that. Old lady, she needs to walk around while we're in the meeting. You know, to be fair, if you're going to have a meeting that's more than 50 minutes long, then everyone should be walking around, in my opinion. Another thing that I found since we recorded this episode, after I appeared on a great radio show with Sinead Moynihan, with Rira Manar, we had guests, one of whom is Sinead's sister, Elaine Moynihan, and her partner, Katie McShane, from the Wisewater Academy. And when I was talking about this issue of, you know, sometimes feeling emotionally overwhelmed with the work that I can be doing, one of the two wise women talked about the importance of the color blue, and that you should blue your mind effectively. And I know Bobby talked about this in a slightly different context in a post on LinkedIn recently. But bluing your mind is actually flooding your senses with blue because of water, and that it has a very calming effect. I took that to heart when I've moved overseas, and I have beautiful pictures of the sea, screensavers, I listen to the sound of the sea or the sound of the rain. I have blue everywhere, so I can just blue my mind, even though I'm in a place that is not really surrounded by water and certainly far away from the sea. And, you know, some of these things may sound silly or simple, and they probably are, but the thing is that we don't do them. They may be simple, but they are things that we need to remind ourselves to do. For anyone who still feels stuck about maybe what they could be doing, or how they can start to work on self-compassion, then I strongly advise you to go and listen to Kristin Neff, and I called her Kristin Neff all the way through the episode. I am so sorry, Kristin. To look at what your restorative practices might be. And obviously, Bobby has a great one in the episode, which relates to visualization of effectively your happy place, and having a really great vision of that and being able to turn it up and turn it down, just to give your mind the space to be able to process whatever it is that you're processing. And so ultimately, this idea of being kind to ourselves is we should be showing the same kindness, concern, and care to ourselves as we would to a dear friend. And it's really as simple as that. And now I'm going to hand you over to the episode. So even if you've listened before, have a listen again and see if you missed any little gems. And if you haven't listened, then enjoy.
Welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week we're talking about self-compassion and resilience. How do we put our own mask on first to ensure we have sufficient emotional and physical resources to have a reserve ready for times of high stress and avoid getting burnt out? Come and join us for Being a Stand for Self-Compassion. Hi Bobby, how are you feeling today?
Hello, although I have just referred to myself as the Croakmeister, so I have my instructions for what to do if I start coughing to death, but I don't think that, well, I'm hoping that won't be an issue. We'll see. But apart from that, I'm feeling, I don't use the word fine after our other recording. I'm good, a little under the weather, but I am good and looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, yes, I had a word with you this morning about, we're talking about self-care, aren't we, or self-compassion at least, and how that relates to resilience in the workplace or more generally in our lives. And you're burning the candle at both ends and suffering for it a little bit.
Yeah, I know. So I suppose the other thing I've got to be slightly mindful of is a bolt of lightning coming shooting down from the sky, as I'm saying these things about self-compassion and its correlation with resilience when, well, I think I'd like to say that, okay, I've got a sore throat, but I am being kind to myself in the fact that I love doing this. The mindfulness and the research and the things that we do, or the things that we get to talk about to remind ourselves how to be, I think that there is a level of self-compassion in that. And I've had such a journey with self-compassion that even though I'm a little bit croaky today, I was super eager to actually be in this conversation. So I think this is good for me. It's nurturing in a way.
Yeah, well, when I was, again, having a look at this, doing some research, looking at sort of all the elements that fit together, and one of the things that came out of both research on resilience and on self-compassion, because often they overlap, is this idea of nurturing and filling your life with things that you enjoy. And obviously you've done that this weekend, haven't you? You've been with your beloved.
I have.
You've been watching the
My
rugby,
favourite.
and now you're getting to chat
I
to me.
know. I mean, what's not to love? Clearly. So it is good. And turning into the things that you love doing and that you feel the greatest gratitude for. I mean, that's one of the things that I think will come up as we're talking about this topic. But really grateful to have had the weekend that I have had and am having. So even though, you're a little bit below ebb, it's not I have to go out and do 3,000 things and the forever pushing myself and, wearing myself absolutely to the bone, which has been an also version of myself when I wasn't as self-compassionate with me. I'm interested though, Bridge, because I think both of us have a story to tell about how we've got to where we are with our level of self-compassion. Where are you at with yours?
Yeah, I have to say I was chuckling along about some of the things when I was looking at some of these things about how they related to a lot of the things that you have been very open and vulnerable about on podcast episodes. But then I also then have to stop chuckling a little bit because then I'm like, fuck, that's me too. I have suffered because of a failure to be compassionate with myself. One of the interesting things that I found was when I was looking at this, sort of the various lists of things that in terms of how we build resilience, how we are more self-compassionate, was that you actually have to be proactive in it. And you also have to recognize your suffering. You have to recognize where you are not in the best place. And if you don't, it leads to burnout. And I know that very, very well because I've suffered from burnout. And it was really only then that I became aware of having to actually proactively take steps to be more compassionate with myself, to give myself a break, to do all the things to create the resilience that I had lost prior to the burnout. Because one of the impacts of leaders and team members not being compassionate with themselves and not building and creating the resilience that they need, or the sort of ability to bounce back, is that you end up with burnouts. And I know that when I was in Gaza, I got to a point where I was making very poor decisions. I was not leading in the way that I should have done. And I very much regret that, but I am able to recognize that that was not just a failure in myself. It was something that I wasn't doing for myself to feed, to nourish what I needed. And so I do now pay attention to it more, although I found a psychologist called Kristin Neff, who is an evangelist on self-compassion. And so I'm going to put a whole load of her stuff into the resources, because there's really loads of things in there that are really useful, and how she links it with resilience, and also some exercises that she gives, which are really, really useful and quite and short, which is helpful. But she's got this self-compassion scale, and you can go on the site and you can give yourself a score. And I'm still not scoring very well, so I've obviously still got some work to do, but it's a journey, right? It's just, I have to keep growing in terms of being able to quell those voices that are not so helpful, in terms of being kind to yourself.
Yeah. Well, always a work in progress. I was thinking when I was going through this as well, and I know that I have said some stuff on other episodes, and I couldn't remember if I'd ever said about the aha moment. It's because I have grown up. I have grown up, and I think that these things have been said before, where there were those things where if I didn't do well enough, I got ignored. If I failed an exam, I was told to take it again, but there was no recognition given to the exams that I had passed. If I gave a result, I was asked where other people in the class had come, where was I in the ranking orders? And that was both of my parents, and I don't think badly of them for it. I have done for a long, long time, because I think with parenting as well, there's that, you're making that up as you go along as well, and trying to do your best. And in some bizarre way, I think that they were attempting to toughen me up or trying to make me do better. But what it did was it had these voices take root. And then we've talked about shitty bosses who might have been piling more of this stuff on as I was continuing to grow up and grow into an adult. But it wasn't until I started doing my development work, and I'd say, oh, well, I'm like this because my mum said this and my dad said that, and there was a boss, and all these voices have taken root. And eventually one of my coaches said, Bobby, it's not their voice, it's yours. And I think that there's almost like that level of awareness and acceptance is the first thing. You can't really get any further until you take responsibility for who it is that's talking to you, and it's you. So I appreciate, and I know you were talking about the environment, and that will, of course, affect and lead to the levels of burnout and the things that you've talked about. But in other points of time, I also reckon that where I come on the scale wouldn't be that great, because I can still be really harsh with myself. I'm very good at doing it for other people, being kind and what have you. But we've said before, haven't we, about talking to yourself like you're talking to your best friend. And the other one that I came across was this level of reparenting. And I talk about this without trying to get too deep with coaching clients and freaking them out a bit. But often I'll say to people, how old is the voice that's talking to you? And mine's a teenager. It's my bullshit asshole self having a right go. And so this level of talking about reparenting, I've become quite interested in reparenting yourself, because it's almost like you have to learn how to talk to that version of yourself which isn't really adulting, and you're letting them be in the driving seat. And again, it may well be that I've brought some of these things up before in other recordings, but I think because we are talking about the topic of self-compassion, being able to get to that it's not until that point that you can start then looking at self-kindness, affirmations, the reparenting, because you've got to recognize who it is that's speaking.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I do like that. I think I'm sure that there's lots of research. In fact, the lovely Kristin Neff, who I have to say has done some interviews with Saint Brené. So you get the double whammy of lady wisdom. And I'll also share those, because then it goes into these things about that self-compassion is the antidote to shame. And obviously Brené has got lots to say about shame and the impacts on teams, and how, that sort of shame element is correlated with aggression, violence, bullying, addiction, suicide. And so it all sort of comes together in a sort of amazing, I don't know how to describe it, a Rubik's Cube, I don't know, of these lots of pieces that have to fit together, and understanding that, we learn self-criticism, or many of us do, from a really early age. And so that idea of, as I said, you have to recognize it, and then also then take the steps to take responsibility for it. I quite like these ideas of reframing these self-critical thoughts. We've already talked about, would you speak to a friend or a loved one like this, that do as you would be done by, but actually don't do to others what you do to yourself. Because I think it would be really rare for us to say to someone that we cared about some of the things that we say to ourselves that our own voices say. So sort of recognizing all of that, but also then skills that are needed to be able to be resilient. And that's this idea of being able to bounce back, being able to adapt to change, all of those things that are really important in life and as they are in business. But there's sort of various skills that have been identified. And as I looked through various articles and various bits of research, a lot of them were very similar. Having a growth mindset, and we've covered that in Being at Your Edge. So if anyone wants to go and re-listen to that episode to get more details, that means that you can deal with setbacks, you can deal, and that you view them as temporary, that it's not the end of the world. You view them as opportunities for growth and learning, that you are able to problem solve, gathering information, asking good and thoughtful questions. And obviously we've got a couple of episodes on that. We've got constantly curious and being comfortable with curiosity and superpowering collaboration. All of those are about finding ways through things, but also seeking support and having that vulnerability to actually say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing about this, or I'm feeling out of my depth here, I need help, before you get to that point where something goes horribly wrong and you're blaming yourself for being an idiot. But self-care comes up time and time and again in all of these lists, whether it's in Forbes, whether it's in HBR, whether it's in endless LinkedIn posts and articles. And then the other one is managing stress. And I was going to sort of come to you about that, because for me, when I recognized I was really struggling, I went and did some CBRT, which is compassion-based resilience training, which I found super useful, and had some aha moments about how cruel I was being to myself. But there's loads of others, aren't there? Breathing, mindfulness, journaling. But I guess there must be some other more somatic practices that are to do with this. When you start to feel that, either that voice or the stress or the anxiety, even if you don't hear a voice, it's just a sort of automatic response to things that you might be doing.
Yeah, for sure. So with the training that I've come to over the last 10 years in now, but the bodily practices, but in both the coaching worlds that I work in, when I first was beginning in my development, I think there was very much around, I had to get quiet. So there was the sitting practice, there was meditation, there was rest, there was the skill of learning to do absolutely nothing and just being with myself. And it was absolutely excruciating. I don't think I've ever been in so much pain, emotionally and physically. I was like, how can something so lovely feel so fucking awful? But it really did. Because, of course, what was going on, and my massive exploration into the body and the somatic since then was because I was breaking armor. My heart hurt so much I thought I'd torn a muscle or was having a heart attack. It was the most extraordinary thing, from just sitting still or putting myself in child pose, things like that, things that are meant to be really beautiful. And you hear from everybody, oh, yoga's amazing and meditation is amazing. I was like, I am living in hell. And it went on like that for quite a while. I have to say, there were some dark times with that, but I definitely came out the other side of it. And then going, oh, well, this is really extraordinary. I want to know more. So with the somatic practices, there's a few things, but we talk about, in my line of work, conditioned tendencies, which are basically your triggers. And what you're doing when you are actually getting so much more in touch with what's happening in the body, less so what's happening in your head, you start finding the triggers. So in fact, we have practices, we call them grab practices, where you are working as a pair and you literally grab somebody by the arm and you'll say to them, what's the best phrase to bring up a reaction in you? So I had hours on end of somebody grabbing my arm and saying to me, you're not good enough. And just finding where that lived in my body and learning to settle it and learning to know it wasn't true. But the physicality of that was extraordinary because, again, you could feel, you feel sort of like quite unsteady on your feet or burning in your chest, or mine also happened in my throat, because if somebody goes to criticize me, or not so much now, but criticize me or gave the impression that I wasn't good enough, I'd also learnt to swallow it back down. As much as say, I wanted to shout, yes, I frigging am. How dare you? I'm doing my best, all of that. But I didn't. And again, as I was learning something different, I thought I had swallowed a Dorito and it had got stuck in my throat because of the actual physical reaction of learning to speak up and stand up for myself.
Jesus, Bobby, my anxiety levels, I'm sort of all scrunched up listening to you because I can't imagine the courage to be able to, that's just incredible, to put yourself through. My whole body is just going, I find it fascinating also, this idea of that. I hate yoga too. I can't do the child's pose. I just can't get into it. And so, yeah, I'm sort of,
I still
that.
cry now when I put myself into child's pose, because there's some, again, visceral reaction about self-soothing, self-comforting that brings up and again, a lot of the time when some of these things are being done, the other thing that you have to learn is to not try to rationalize it. So, you can't have people saying to you, oh, where's that come from? What's the story behind that? Because half the time I go, I don't know, but it's happening. I mean, it's the most inordinate learning of acceptance. And it was horrific and yet absolutely gorgeous all at the same time. Because I think you've said that that I feel different, sound different. I talk about different things than when you first met me in my 20s. And it's as a result of
yes, yeah, absolutely.
It's as a result of going through all of that and just coming out of stuckness. That's why I now do the work that I do, because I am living proof of that level of, oh my frigging God, is just so flipping worth it in terms of what it opens up when you can learn to be kind to yourself and stand up for yourself. Being kind to yourself is standing up for yourself as well. And that's where I think the correlation of resilience comes in as well. So I feel much more resilient in self with not having that voice take the driving seat anymore.
I think another element of the, as you say, standing up for yourself, one of the other elements that I came across was this idea of managing boundaries. So, there was a whole load of things that you need to do to actively learn and grow into being resilient and, prioritizing self-care, which includes managing your boundaries. And we did a big episode on that with being guilt-free with a no with the lovely James Fulford Talbot. But things like sleep, getting enough sleep, getting exercise, eating healthily, doing things that nourish you, that idea of the happy list. And, we did a whole episode on happiness as well, on being happy with happiness. So all of that builds a reserve. And when I look back to the times where I have really not prioritized self-care or any of those things, and have then lost my reserve and not been resilient to, really, really difficult working conditions, and then burnt out, have been where I haven't been getting enough sleep. I haven't been prioritizing, setting aside time for exercise because I'm too busy. I've just been eating a load of crap because, one, I haven't got time to cook, or just I'm eating things that are comforting, which generally aren't particularly healthy, not particularly comforted by broccoli, unfortunately, or raw carrots. So that, just putting it out there. So I think that, those things of speaking out, to be able to set your boundaries and say no, to say I can't do that, or to say I need to reprioritize, or to say I'm going to be delegating that, and it not being self-indulgent, because I think that sometimes there is a concern, when people have conversations, and we've had this thing about things that are fluffy, things that are soft skills, but actually when men or women vocalize a need to prioritize their self-care as part of them being a good team member or team leader, there is this, often for many people, this feeling that it's just self-indulgent rather than it is necessary for everyone to be able to function well, effectively, efficiently, and be resilient for when they need to be. People don't realize that it's actually necessary. It's not a nice to have thing. How important it is, and it isn't prioritized by many, many people. And one of the other things I think is that it's really important that as a leader, you demonstrate an ability to be self-compassionate, to show compassion to yourself, because without it, you can't empathize with other people. And so, again, there's a whole issue about modeling.
I completely agree. I mean, I read in preparation for this somewhere about, it's not fluff, it's real. And for leaders, what it was saying is that level of kindness, self-compassion, however you want to describe it, there are the benefits, and both philosophically and scientifically. Because when a leader is in that version of themselves where they're not very good at dealing with their mistakes, they take failure very personally, there's not a lot of forgiveness, there's that harsh self-talk, they're driving themselves too hard. From the science perspective, and we've talked about this before, but the cortisol goes up big time. Whereas if they are really looking at being compassionate, generous, caring, of service, so they're building trust and belonging and safety in their teams, then both their oxytocin gets better, as does everybody else's. Why wouldn't anybody want that? Why wouldn't you want to be in a leadership role doing that? And that is not fluff. That's real. So I'm in complete agreement with that. But we're back to this whole business that until they can be compassionate with themselves, it is really tricky to really feel like being compassionate with other people. I was thinking, when I was that reparenting, I didn't start reparenting myself before I had step-parented and parented. And I think that's where I first caught onto it, because I was so quick to want to drive them, the children, in the way that I had been, when all of them wanted to be much more laid back at school than I ever was or was ever allowed to be. And there were things that were just almost ready to leap out of my mouth when one of them would say they got 9 out of 10 in a spelling test, and I want to ask which one they got wrong. So I started learning very quickly to do it with other people. But I think that leaders are the same. Again, if they're being harsh with themselves, it's too easy to do that with other people. So big stand for self-compassion. And as we say, not fluffy at all. Fluffy is a word I hate. Other than when I'm talking about puppies and rabbits.
Yes, or sometimes cushions.
Yes.
So, I mean, we've talked about self-kindness before, and we had that lovely episode with the wonderful Nina Sims. And the definition that Kristin Neff had given to self-kindness is to try to be understanding and patient towards aspects of your personality you don't like. And it just made me think back to, I think Nina had, and possibly you as well, had talked about a book by Richard Schwartz,
Yes.
Which was
No Bad Parts. Brilliant book.
And that, I guess, really plays into that here. And again, I think also St. Brené, Gift of Imperfection, this idea that we recognize that, we're human. Everybody's human. We all make mistakes. We're all imperfect. We're all trying to be better. And that sort of common humanity, dampening down some of the self-judgment and much more of the self-kindness, realizing you're not alone. I think a lot of people, when they fail at something or they feel that they've failed at something, feel as if they're the only person in the world who is feeling that way or has ever felt that way. And then obviously things like mindfulness and not over-identifying with these feelings. You get carried away, you get wrapped up in the enormity of the terrible, terrible thing that's happened because you got 9 out of 10 on a maths test.
Yeah.
So I think that, all of those things come together. And if you can do that for yourself, then obviously, as you said, you can do it for others. And it's a great question. Why would a leader not want to do that? And when you ask that question, I'm sort of a bit like, yeah, I don't know. Can't think of a single reason why a leader wouldn't want, or an organization wouldn't want to have an environment where that is normal.
Exactly. And I keep not wanting to interrupt you, but you say Kristin Neff. I thought it was Kristin Neff.
Oh, okay. Hang on a minute. I'm going to Google it.
Because unless there are two people with the first name Kristin, one with Neff and one with Kev, who are talking about those three key things that you're saying: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness.
You are absolutely right, Kristin Neff. Thank you for bringing that up, because otherwise everyone would have been going,
who is she talking about?
And also I suspect if she ever listens to it, she'll be like, what do you mean, Kristin Neff? And having talked recently about getting people's names right, that's a big mea culpa. But yeah, that's just my terrible note taking. And yes, I have a habit of thinking in this word begins with a letter, and then that's the letter I accompany it to. So Kristin Neff.
This is absolutely brilliant, isn't it? Because here we have a live example of self-compassion, because you were saying about the eating the good food, the making time for exercise, etc. I also go down this route of self-compassion. Self-care is around bubble baths, and relaxation. That was one of the reasons why all the development practices for me were tiny and soft and restorative, when I'm going, what the hell? But I think that the other element to it is acknowledging feelings, forgiving yourself for mistakes, understanding that you are so much more than your achievements and title. We've also done an episode around all of that. And, just going, yeah, we're human, we're flawed, we cock up every now and again. And that's what I love about our podcasts, because we give it warts and all. It's not this perfect, polished, shiny Instagram thing, which is just bullshit. Somebody had written, we are masterpieces in progress from our experiences, our efforts, our emotions, which can't be replicated or replaced. And I think that is when you're really being compassionate to self, when you just go, I get up every day and I'm doing my best, and I will persevere, and I will care, and I'll look to learn, and I'll look to improve. And again, those are things that I want to see in leaders, those mantras, that's what they're aiming for every day, and giving themselves a break.
I love that. Yes. Well, I have to say I had various aha moments on, I guess, not worrying too much about having making a mistake in public, because when I was a barrister, as a not even a very junior barrister, being in front of judges who will turn around to you and go, "Is that your best point, Miss Forster?" After you've just given a very long, complicated, whatever it is, clever oratory piece, persuasive piece about something, and that's their response, makes you feel about
Yay
the
high.
size of a
Yeah.
thumb. And actually just being able to just go, yeah, okay, fair point, because actually lots of times you haven't got a great case, and you're just doing the best you can with something that's not brilliant, and the judge knows that, and actually pretty much everyone, maybe apart from your client, already knows that. So yeah, I've been through so many of those moments where you'd quite like to shrink down and disappear, to eventually get into a point where you're like, yeah, that's another one, and what else, I didn't die, it's just a story to tell that you can joke about in the pub afterwards,
Exactly.
and life goes on. So yeah, that is one thing I have learnt. But I think with other things, I think most of my judgment comes about my interactions with other people. So my real self-critical voice is about, not managing my emotions, or how someone has felt bad, or I have lost my temper over something. All of those things, where you replay them in your mind over and over again, years and years and years later, about, oh, and that happened, and I should have done this, and I didn't do this, or that. What's the word? I think I've raised it before in one of the episodes about le mot d'escalier, which is, I should have said that. That's the perfect response to, or that would have been, being calm and actually talking to them rationally, rather than just losing your shit and running out and slamming the door. So those are things that I still need to deal with in myself.
But you're not still doing that though, are you? Or are you?
Oh yeah, I think that I have my moments, and I'm much more aware of it now, and so I think that I find that I'm able to
Yeah.
stop that. So if I can feel it, but it still goes on, it'll be a couple of evenings or dreams or nights trying to sleep going, ah. Most of the time I can stop it, but not always. I've got a few that still
Yeah.
play over years later.
And I do think that's where there is this correlation with resilience, because what can happen, and I'm with you, those things that wake you up in the middle of the night that you think that you've forgotten about from years past, whatever it might be. But without self-compassion, that's when you are spiraling into blame, which we've talked about, of course, the despair, when things haven't gone as planned, all of those sort of elements, and the shoulda, coulda, woulda sketch. And I think with self-compassion, and this is where I sort of like come out with resilience, is that where you start trusting yourself more, that you've got this. That's not likely to happen again because you've got this. That you're asking for help because you no longer believe that you'll be judged or seen as weak. And taking a breath. And the word we keep using, curiosity, to be in that level of willingness to learn, and then still accepting, back to the self-compassion, that you'll have days when you will go and squawk at somebody and storm out and slam the door. I still do that regularly, and I pick myself up and dust myself off. Or the other thing that I'm much better at now is saying sorry. Still probably with a really bad look on my face. But I think that that's where the resilience piece comes in as well. And I think that in those moments, if they are waking you up at night, that's the reparenting moment. That, I think that I read somewhere where you'll be really worrying about somebody else, but they're sort of like saying that everyone is not thinking about you as much as you think they are. And don't believe everything you think. I think it's a good one as well. And I think that those things help in those sort of moments.
I found, talking of bubble baths, I found a really cute little self-compassion, it's an exercise for self-compassion video. Although, having said that, it is also slightly odd that the animation is slightly odd. So that it does involve a bath. All I can say is if anyone watches it, I apologize in advance about the bath bit of the animation because it is weird, but it's kind of cute in terms of the exercise and talking about a lot of the things that, Bobby, you've talked about in terms of getting to that point of if you're struggling to do things to deal with your need for self-compassion.
Yeah. Oh.
I will put the link on in the resources, but again, just with that caveat of apologies for the bath scene.
Well, I haven't got a bath scene. I also was going to say a little something about a TED talk I came across from a lady called Dr. Lucy Hone. I'm now worried that I've got the names wrong, that I've written it down wrong after, but it's about resilience. And honestly, this woman is amazing because she is there on this TED talk talking about having lost her 12-year-old daughter in a car accident. And I'm like, oh my God. And I won't go into massive detail, but she came up with 3 resilient strategies to navigate through tougher times. And I thought they were superb because one was resilient people know that shit happens. Suffering is part of every human existence. So, that whole level of, rather than the victim, why me, sort of like sketch, you go, yeah, this is part of the norm. I'm not the only. It's back to that correlation, isn't it, with the common humanity. I'm not the only one that's going through this loss or this grief or this terrible job or whatever it might be. So that was the first one. 2, resilient people are really good at choosing where to put their attention. So I think you were saying earlier about, spiraling into the negative emotions. And she says that negative emotions stick like Velcro, whereas positive ones bounce off really quickly. And I think that went back to what we were talking about before about, was it 5 pieces of great feedback get eradicated by one bad bit? So it's sort of like, I thought it fitted in with that. And then the third one that she says is resilient people ask themselves, is what I'm doing helping or harming me? That's a question I should ask myself a lot. But the video, it's not long. She's extraordinary. And so I'm sharing that as well because I think it's definitely a brilliant watch.
Really cool. Wow. Yes, I'm going to have to have a look at that. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that there's some of those things would be useful for me too. And because we're talking about resilience and this, how closely linked self-compassion is to resilience, VUCA world, there was some research by David Zabara who looked at people getting divorced actually, and that self-compassion, his students identified words that were indicators of a self-compassionate mindset, was the most accurate predictor of whether they were coping positively 6 months down the line. And they also found with veterans that self-compassion was more predictive of whether or not they would get PTSD than the level of combat that they had engaged in, which I found really interesting. That it's so powerful, and the link is extraordinarily powerfully lit. The link is an extraordinary one. It's not just, as you say, this is not something that should be put aside as a nice thing to have. Or, organizations, the military, leaders, members of teams, individual people living their lives. It's such an important element of being able to survive terrible things happening to you. And not everyone has terrible things happen to them, but everybody has to deal with things that are not great. And if you don't have that reserve that's created by the self-compassion, then you are more likely than not going to end up in anxiety, burnout, depression, or worse, simply because we haven't prioritized and don't acknowledge how important it is.
I think one of the key things, if people do little else but that creation of that reserve that you're saying, is that benefit finding gratitude, whatever language you want to use to it. That practice of gratitude, hunting for good in the world, is what helps build the reserve. So I often with clients do what I call a resilience practice, which is like a visualization, but we all have that perfect spot. You know, mine's a lake, a landscape, or dipping my toes in the sea, something like that, but something that you can shut your eyes and be taken to straight away. Other people, it might be, I don't know, Glastonbury, massive rock concert. It doesn't matter. It's the thing that brings you that juicy warmness that you feel all over your body, that makes you feel really, really great. And just be in that for 5 minutes. And you can turn the volume up on it, make the lights brighter, make the sound noisier, whatever it might be within that visualization that you're doing, or dampen it down a bit if you need it to be more restful. But that practice is another way of building the reserve. And you can take yourself there with a click of a finger or fingers. And I think that it's little
Lovely.
practices like that I think just keep us in that space where we can be kind to ourselves and, as a result, kind to others.
Lovely. Right. Well, we've reached the end of that episode with loads of information, lots of things to think about, lots of practices to be kind to ourselves. Do you have a quote?
I do, and it's from Helen Keller this time around. And she is quoted as saying, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it."
Nice one. Thanks, Bobby.
Go forth and be kind.
To yourself.
Yes, and you too. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. All of the resources are going to be on the podcast page and on our website. Next week, we're going to be doing some more reflection, or I am, on the concept of blame and lessons learnt, another big issue for where I'm working and how I'm working right now. And in the meantime, keep being kind to yourself, and I'll see you next week. Bye.